They called it an accident. Neighbors from the valley spoke of a stray spark, an overturned lamp, a kitchen hearth left to smolder while the household slept. The official report, dutifully stamped and archived, declared a tragic mischance at Santa Cecilia. But the third floor of that old manor had been keeping a secret for 3 years, and when the smoke found the rafters, it revealed more than ash. The secret in the attic. What the lady kept hidden for 3 years was not simply a cache of documents or a stolen trinket. It was a ledger of crimes and confessions, a slow ritual of retribution, and a room that had learned the language of silence. The flames ate the curtains and then the beams. A single candle guttered, the leather cover of a notebook flared, and something that had been alive in quiet for years finally died at 2347, as one neighbor later insisted he remembered. When the shutters were forced open and the attic door torn down, the smoke curled like a mantled thing leaving the place. The neighbors sobbed for the house. The magistrate wrote, "Accident." Nobody in public suspected the woman who walked from Santa Cecilia 3 days later, with her head held as if she were still in mourning. Amelia Vasconcelos de Andrade had been 30 when her husband's fever took him. She had been born to a family whose name opened doors and closed mouths. She had inherited land, ledgers, and the household's authority at an age that should have invited pity from society and obedience from its servants. What she had inherited but never expected, and would not let go of, was a face from childhood, Benedita, who had been born on the estate and whose life was counted in rationed days and recorded chores. Their bond had begun with shared mischief among mango trees and secret passages through the sugar cane. It hardened into something forbidden, tender, and dangerous as the two women grew into one another's confidants and eventually into one another's refuge. The world Amelia inhabited was twofold: the polished parlor where guests sipped imported wine, and the work-worn sheds where the estate's wealth was made by hands that were not free. She understood both worlds with a clarity that made her an effective mistress and, in private, a culpable witness. She would sit near Benedita at dusk, their knees brushing under the table as fez and candlestick made long shadows on the floor, and they would talk in the hush that only the enslaved and their closest allies knew. There were moments of tenderness, a braid put right, a secret letter burned, threaded through a life ordered by grief and expectation. When Baron Joaquim de Andrade revealed his true face, it was not all at once. He had a laugh that made guests lean forward, a hand that placed coins with theatrical generosity. But one night, calloused and cruel, he and his overseer, Tomás Ferreira, showed the household the calculus by which they kept order. They hunted a young man named Geronimo, who had slipped the estate to seek freedom. Geronimo had been a boy who repaired tools and hummed while he worked, a man who liked the taste of ripe guava and used to whistle at dawn. He had been caught and dragged back to Santa Cecilia. What followed was heard through cracked doors and thin walls, cries, the drag of rope, a silence that fell like a heavy lid. The overseer Tomás, broad-shouldered, practiced in the trade of punishment, was the instrument. The Baron watched, eyes bright with a satisfaction Amelia had never seen in him before. She stood in the corridor and pressed her fingers to a polished banister until they went numb. She had seen lash and reprimand in the name of property before. She thought she had known the edges of cruelty. That night she realized cruelty could be exquisite, deliberate, dressed as duty. Geronimo did not return to the fields. When the yard went quiet and the dogs did not bark, Amelia's hands trembled with a decision that would unmake her life as she had known it. The wrongdoing at Santa Cecilia was not a spectacle for the entire district. It was a private violence that found its way into the pages of Amelia's hidden ledger. In the weeks after, she watched her husband as one observes a plagued animal, fever crawling into his joints, the slow seeding of appetite, a body that aged before its time. There were physicians paid to pronounce symptoms and comforts offered in measured doses. The Baron's death was unremarkable enough in form to preserve the family's reputation, and unremarkable enough, in fact, to open the house's ledger to new entries. He died in a room that smelled of boiled orange rind and bitter tonic. Amelia arranged his funeral with the same hands that had tied his cravat. Tomás stayed. He had specialized value on an estate like Santa Cecilia, an overseer who took the unpleasantries of discipline so the family's hands might remain clean. Amelia could have cast him out or handed him over to justice as it existed in those parts. She did neither. Instead, she allowed Tomas to keep his wages and his authority, even while she tightened a net of attention and watchfulness around him. It was not courage as the world defines it, but a slow bureaucratic cruelty of a different sort. Patience turned punitive. She hatched a plan that would turn Tomas from lord of punishment into captive of confession. Benedita, whose life had always balanced on the edge of choice and survival, became her most intimate conspirator. They worked in the folds of a society that forbade their companionship and punished their defiance. They found a weapon that belonged to neither law nor mob. They found that the house had a third floor, an attic that had been used for linen and rum barrels, an underused space that no polite visitor ever saw. The attic belonged to silence. It held old trunks and forgotten portraits, rats' nests and the taste of dust in the air. It harbored secrets because nobody came to look there. The first time they took Tomas up the narrow stairs, it was under the pretense of discussing accounts, an old ruse that would not arouse suspicion among those who assumed a woman's mind to be only good for charity and needlework. Tomas came with a swagger and a flask in his coat. Once the door closed, it became, in effect, a tribunal without a court. No witnesses save for a woman who had loved and lost, and a woman who had never been allowed to speak for herself. The two of them bound a man who had bound others. They tied him not to teach him pain, but to make him speak. They did not shout. They did not set themselves as executioners in spectacle. They asked questions, and when Tomas balked, they reminded him of faces he had seen on his hands at dawn. The hearing began. What followed over 3 years resembled nothing so much as a ritualized interrogation and a private archive being built at the same time. Tomas was not murdered in a single furious moment. He was kept alive, slowly unmade. Small medicines, herbal, bitter, given in moments of intimacy, left him weakened and attentive, where brute force would only have allowed resistance in rage. Do not read this as a recipe for harm. It is the outline of a moral experiment. A woman who had power deciding to use it as a just instrument, and a woman who had none agreeing to bear the weight of complicity. Every week under the candle's watch, Tomas confessed. The confessions had a rhythm, a scrape of pen, the sigh of cloth on wood, Benedita folding and pouring wine. At first he told names with a shrug, curt as a ledger entry: Geronimo, Cipriano, Benedito. Each name had a short life attached to it: Cipriano, who died with a hand still clutching a hoe; Benedito, who left behind a child who would later be raised in silence; Geronimo, whose whistling habit became proof of his daring. These were not abstractions. The women wrote them down with the care someone uses to copy a family Bible. Amelia kept a leather-bound notebook for these confessions. Its cover grew soft by the time it held 127 pages. She wrote methodically, not because she loved paper, but because she wanted the truth to be legible even if courts would never read it. The ledger contained dates, times, the names of those who had been punished to death, and short particulars that stitched each victim to a human moment: the spices he liked, the child who called him godfather, the day he had been laughed at by a plantation mistress for spilling water on her hem. Each anecdote undercut the language of property and replaced it with a human ledger. Benedita sometimes added the little flourishes: an entry about a bowl of cassava left to cool, or a stolen mango eaten in secret, so the notebook would read less like accusation and more like remembrance. Between confessions there were moments you might call domestic, if domestic were not a word that had always meant different things to different people. Amelia would stitch sheets, Benedita would tend a fire, and Tomas would cough into a kerchief and mutter memories he had been paid not to tell. Sometimes in the collapse between hatred and fatigue, a strange intimacy bloomed. One night, when a storm pressed its weight against the shutters, Amelia found herself pressing a cool hand to Tomas's brow and thinking, not of vengeance or even of justice, but of the human task of easing suffering. Benedita saw it and did not scold. She had her own wounds, and in those small hours she allowed a gentleness that might otherwise have been denied. The slow disassembly of Tomas's authority had its moral cost. Each confession, each written line, made the women more like judges and less like victims. They rehearsed justice in a corner of the world that had no appetite for it. When Tomas spoke of the men he had watched die, how they had clung to a child's wrist, how they had begged, how they had been named in a prayer, Amelia's heart fractured anew. There were small private temptations toward mercy, a moment of pity, a thought that perhaps the law might have some remedy if only it were willing. But the law of the land was not for the enslaved. It was a shell that sheltered property and punished the uprising of those who had none. In the house's formal world there was no redress for what the overseer had done. The years passed with the monotony of ritual. The notebook swelled. The women learned the sound of Tomas's admissions and the small lies he told to survive. They learned not to trust the ease with which memory can be coached. They practiced a cruelty that was intended as corrective, not for public spectacle but for keeping an account. The ledger became a moral ledger in the truest sense, listing deeds that the formal record would not. It also became a weight. There were nights Benedita could not sleep, because the ceiling of the attic had become the vault of every face she had ever seen a rope over. There were mornings Amelia could not smell coffee without remembering what death smells like on a person who has been made small for too long. On an August evening, 3 years after the first confession, the book was full. 127 pages of names, of small human details, of staccato entries that kept growing denser as memory demanded elaboration. Amelia turned the final page with the reverence of someone closing a prayer book. She had written out each account, she had catalogued each crime, and she had measured, as precisely as human anger allows, the debt she felt was owed. There was one line left to write. Not an accusation, but a sentence that would end the matter privately and absolutely. They gave Tomas a final cup that night. The details of what was in it do not matter. What matters is what the women were asking of him. The final revelation was both a repetition and a culmination. The names he swore he alone remembered, the particulars he had hidden, the small, ugly accompaniments that made each killing not only an act, but a careful practice. Tomas died as he had lived, claiming to be less than he was, then saying too much. He reached for Amelia's hand, and she lifted it to his forehead, as one might bless a man at the end of time. Benedita watched like someone looking at a body of water that has not yet calmed. There was no rejoicing. There was a quiet as if the household itself were holding its breath to see what shape their future would take. After Tomas's death, Amelia set a new plan in motion. The attic had to be purged of the tangible elements that might reveal too much. Implements that marked a man's employment, the evidence of the women's complicity, the ink-stained papers that could be traced. She locked the door and prepared what she called a purification. The language she used, purify, was not sanctimonious so much as practical. She had to erase the risk that the notebook, the names, the confessions, would be discovered by eyes that would either punish or dismiss them. The house had already taught her that records could be both shield and weapon. She chose erasure. When the flames moved through the attic, they seemed to observers to come from nothing. A knocked-over lamp, a stray ember, explanations easy enough to write and read in a society that preferred tidy narratives. But to those who had kept watch in candlelight for years, the fire felt like the closing of a ledger. The leather cover blackened and curled. The ink that had once been so legible bubbled and went mute. The smoke rose and carried with it the smell of melted wax, scorched paper, and something like relief. Publicly, Amelia grieved. She organized the household, wiped the soot from her sleeves, and made her inquiries about the cause of the blaze with the exacting care of a woman who understood both appearances and how fragile they were. She paid for repairs, reassured neighbors, and insisted on a funeral for the things that had been lost, old portraits, a trunk of letters that had, conveniently, belonged to the barrow. She made sure the official record would call it an accident. Privately, she made others disappear in a different sense. She used the fire as a cover to move Benedita into a new sort of life. She freed Benedita on paper, filed the necessary documents, paid the necessary fees, and then arranged for the sale of the estate. In the auctions pages, Santa Cecilia passed into other hands, and with it the public history that had been its currency. Amelia and Benedita left together not as fugitives, but as women who had arranged their own migration. They walked away with small trunks, with a few gowns, with a pocket of cash, and with a secret that was as heavy as anything they had carried before. But not all evidence was ash. The leather notebook, miraculously saved by the abolitionist priest who had barged into a damaged attic with the zeal of a man who saw beyond borders, survived the flames in scorched and smudged fragments. He had been an unlikely intermediary, part cleric, part activist, who was trusted by those who desired that the truth be known and feared by those who wanted silence. He took what he could salvage and read, privately, the names and the details, and how a woman had carved out her own form of account in a world that would not record it. The priest used the confessions not as a legal dossier so much as a moral petition. He circulated extracts among sympathetic circles, whispered the names of the dead at gatherings, and used the evidence to press a larger point, that the system that permitted such deaths had to be made visible. He advocated for change in rooms where people still preferred polite conversations about profit rather than the cost of human lives. But the notebook had become dangerous in its own right. It held not only the Baron's enemies, but the network of people who had participated, tolerated, or turned a blind eye. Over time, the fragments that the priest possessed were used, read, and then carefully hidden. Some pages were copied and sent overseas to abolitionists who had ears in distant cities. Some entries were bound into pamphlets that vanished into private libraries. The original book, the full leather volume that had held so many confessions, ultimately disappeared. Whether it was entrusted to a sympathizer who buried it, or whether it was destroyed to protect names, or whether it was simply lost amid the churn of changing hands, no one could say with certainty. The official ledger remained empty of the intimate details it had once hoarded, and the public record continued to read the fire as an accident. Amelia and Benedita reinvented themselves in a coastal town where names and pasts blurred in salt air. They took new identities in places where the registry files were thin and strangers asked few questions. They lived with the knowledge that someone in the valley still believed them culpable and someone else thought them righteous. They slept at night with the memory of a man's last breath and the taste of the smoke that had once been used to erase the physical proof of their work. They were in the end not redeemed and not damned in any tidy sense. They were two women who had chosen a course carved by the only instruments they trusted: secrecy, meticulous record-keeping, and an unorthodox sense of moral accounting. When historians later sifted through the scattered documents, pamphlets, second-hand copies, parish notes, some declared Amelia a murderer who had usurped the law. Others called her an avenger who used the only means at her disposal to make the powerful account for their crimes. Many of the names in her ledger: Geronimo, loved for his morning whistle; Cipriano, who had laughter in his throat until rope silenced it; Benedito, who had a small untitled hymnal tucked in his shirt, were remembered by families who had long lists of grievances and a hunger for the truth. The priest's fragments led to heated gatherings and furtive meetings, but the central object, the original book, is lost. There is a disquiet in that loss. The attic, once a place that learned to keep a private court, had been both workshop and confessional, domestic space and tribunal. When it burned, it became an altar and an erasure, a place where memory was both saved and destroyed. The question that lingers is not so much whether Amelia committed a crime, as her magistrate had no appetite to prosecute on the basis of rumor, but whether, in a world that systematically erased certain lives, she chose not only to vindicate some names, but to rewrite the ledger in a manner she alone controlled. There are no simple verdicts. Consider Tomas, a man who had ordered suffering yet also in his last hours offers the human pleas we see often at the end of violent lives. Consider Amelia, a woman who nurtured and killed, who wrote names down and then watched paper burn. Consider Benedita, who survived the double bind of love and enforced servitude, who bore memory as both wound and talisman. Their choices illuminate the grey spaces between law and mercy, between punishment and justice. They ask us to weigh the balance of motives against the scale of consequences. To modern ears, the idea of private retribution unsettles. We are taught to prefer ordered systems, trials with witnesses, and the rule of law. Yet the legal system of Amelia's time and place was itself a mechanism that protected property over people. When formal avenues deny redress, What options remain to those who are bereaved? The story at Santa Cecilia refuses to offer a tidy moral closure. It pushes us toward a question rather than an answer. In a society where law is partial, how should the wronged seek remedy, if at all? The attic remains a symbol, a small upstairs room that bore witness to the intimate labor of justice and the messy shadow it casts. When the new owners of Santa Cecilia pulled down the damaged rafters, they found blackened beams and the remnants of a life scorched by secrecy. They found nothing like a neat confession nailed to a door. They found only the air, still heavy with memory. If you are drawn to stories of hidden histories and hard choices, consider this an invitation to imagine, discuss, and weigh. Was Amelia a villain who justified murder with private law? Was she a woman pushed to the edge by a system that had devoured the lives of those she loved? Or was she something more complicated, a keeper of names, a recorder of human detail, an agent who chose an imperfect and violent remedy in an imperfect and violent world? Share your thoughts below. Tell us which side of the ledger you find yourself on. In the end, the secret the attic kept was not a simple object but a mode of being, an insistence that certain stories be remembered even at the cost of those who recall them. The notebook, the confessions, the 3-year ritual of truth, these things were both proof and portent. They showed a woman ordering the chaos of her grief into lines that could be read, and then choosing to strip those lines from the world with fire. 3 years had been the length of the account. 127 pages bore witness. At 2347 the ledger ceased to burn, and a new ledger, made of rumor, of flesh, of memory, began its work. Santa Cecilia's official papers call it an accident. The priest who saved fragments called it testimony. The neighbors called it tragedy. Amelia and Benedita, who kept their own counsel as they walked into the dusk of their new lives, called it what it had been, a difficult choosing. So the attic keeps its silence, folded into a seam of the house that the new owners never opened. Sometimes after a rain, the wind finds a crack and carries with it the faint scent of smoke and ink, and you might, if you sit very still, feel as if the pages themselves are trying to speak. The record is incomplete, as records so often are. The burning did not, and could not, erase the names entirely, because names live in mouths and bones long after paper is gone. Geronimo whistles in one remembered throat. Cipriano's laugh reaches across a generation. Benedito's hymn is still sung in a hush that avoids the light. This is not the end of the story, nor is it a sentence. It is a question set down in the language of narrative. When the law will not answer, who writes the law and at what cost? The attic's secret remains for now a litany for uneasy souls, urging us to carry names rather than let them be reduced to ledgers of loss. If this story moved you, if it unsettled you or seeded a question you cannot shake, leave a comment below. Tell us whether Amelia was savior, sinner, or something in between. Subscribe for more hidden histories where silence makes things louder, and where the slow work of memory sometimes outlasts the laws that try to bury it.